I need to write this down before they come for me. Before the ISB finishes piecing together what happened aboard the Ravager during those 72 hours we spent trapped in the unknown regions. Before the memory suppression protocols, they're certainly preparing to erase everything I witnessed in that cursed hyperspace corridor where the laws of physics bent like light through corrupted transparasteel, and the Emperor's voice whispered things that couldn't possibly be real, yet somehow were more real than the cold Durasteel deck plating beneath my boots. My name is Lieutenant Jarek Vashon. I served as Auxiliary Communications Officer aboard Imperial Star Destroyer Ravager under Captain Marinval, and what I'm about to document will likely be classified as treason or madness, or both. Will probably result in my execution or worse, reassignment to some black site facility where they keep the personnel who've seen things the Empire prefers to pretend don't exist, who've looked too long at the machinery beneath the propaganda and can no longer pretend the gears aren't grinding up something fundamentally human in their relentless turning. The mission briefing seemed routine enough. A standard patrol sweep through the Outer Rim territories bordering the unknown regions, hunting for rebel supply routes and reasserting Imperial authority in systems that had grown uncomfortably independent during the months following the destruction of the first Death Star. Captain Val delivered the operational parameters in her characteristic monotone, her eyes scanning the assembled bridge crew without actually seeming to see any of us as individuals, reducing us to functional units in whatever strategic calculations occupied her perpetually tactical mind. She'd come up through the ranks during the Clone Wars, had served under Admiral Trench before transferring to Imperial service after the Separatist defeat, and she carried that era's brutal efficiency like a second skin, wore her authority with the casual certainty of someone who'd watched entire planetary populations die and learned to file the experience under acceptable collateral damage without allowing it to interfere with her sleep cycle or requisition paperwork. The jump to hyperspace should have taken us directly to the patrol coordinates, a precisely calculated trajectory that would have deposited us at the edge of Imperial-controlled space, where we could begin our systematic sweep of suspected rebel transit lanes. Instead, approximately 4 hours into the jump, the navigation systems began reporting anomalous readings, spatial distortions that made the hyperspace calculations deviate from their predicted trajectories, as though the fabric of space-time itself was warping around some massive gravitational presence that our sensors couldn't detect, but that was nonetheless pulling us progressively further from our intended course. Senior Navigator Coral, a Bith whose mathematical abilities had earned him a position aboard an Imperial vessel, despite the increasingly xenophobic policies emanating from Coruscant, consulted his instruments with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was seeing something he didn't want to believe, recalculating trajectories multiple times as though expecting the numbers to change if he simply ran them through his processors often enough. Captain Val ordered an emergency reversion to real space, protocol for situations where navigation became unreliable, but the hyperdrive didn't respond to the standard commands, the controls remaining locked in their active configuration as though something was overriding our input and keeping us trapped in the blue-white tunnel of compressed space-time that stretched endlessly in all directions. The backup systems similarly failed to engage. Then the tertiary redundancies, each successive failure ratcheting the tension on the bridge another notch higher, as we collectively realized we were no longer controlling our vessel's trajectory, that something else had taken over the fundamental systems that governed where and when we could exist in normal space. The engineering reports started flooding in, describing systems behaving in ways that violated their operational parameters, power fluctuations that made no sense according to any known principles of reactor dynamics, hull integrity monitors reporting stress patterns that suggested We were somehow experiencing atmospheric drag despite being in hyperspace, where no atmosphere existed. I was monitoring communications when I first heard it, a transmission that shouldn't have been possible because we were in hyperspace where normal electromagnetic radiation couldn't propagate, where the compression of space-time prevented any conventional signal from maintaining coherence across the dimensional barriers that separated us from real space. The audio was distorted, fragmented, but underneath the static I could distinguish what sounded like a voice speaking in high galactic, the formal dialect used in Imperial official communications, but older somehow, the pronunciation suggesting someone who'd learned the language before it had absorbed the standardized inflections that contemporary education programs installed. The words were difficult to parse through the interference, something about convergence and sacrifice, and the necessary price of maintaining order across infinite possibilities, phrases that felt simultaneously portentous and meaningless, the kind of grandiose abstractions that characterized Sith philosophy, or perhaps simply the ramblings of someone whose mind had broken under whatever stresses produced phantom transmissions in impossible locations. Captain Val demanded I identify the source, her voice carrying that edge of controlled fury that suggested she was holding someone responsible for this deviation from acceptable reality, even though no individual's failure could plausibly explain what we were experiencing. I ran every diagnostic protocol I could access, cross-referenced the signal against our databases of known transmission sources, attempted to triangulate its origin through standard communications analysis techniques, but nothing worked because the signal wasn't coming from any external source, wasn't propagating through space in ways that would permit normal tracking. It was simply present, existing simultaneously throughout the ship's communications network as though it had always been there and we were only now noticing it, as though the hyperspace anomaly had somehow made audible something that existed beneath the threshold of normal perception, some fundamental vibration in the structure of reality itself that only became detectable when you traveled through space-time's wrinkles in the wrong way. The crew started exhibiting symptoms approximately 6 hours after we'd become trapped, subtle behavioral changes that initially seemed like normal stress responses to our predicament, but that progressively intensified into something more disturbing. Stormtroopers reported seeing figures in their peripheral vision, shadows that disappeared when directly observed, movement in corridors that should have been empty, according to the internal monitoring systems. Engineering personnel complained of auditory hallucinations, hearing conversations in adjacent compartments that ceased immediately when they entered to investigate, finding only empty chambers that nonetheless retained the acoustic impression of recently vacated presence. Medical Bay experienced an influx of personnel reporting headaches, nosebleeds, a pervasive sensation of being watched that no rational analysis could dismiss, physical symptoms of psychological distress that suggested something was affecting their neurological function at levels that Bacta treatments and standard medications couldn't address. I felt it myself, a pressure that seemed to build behind my eyes whenever I focused on the phantom transmission for too long, a sensation like someone was standing directly behind me, radiating cold disapproval, even though I could verify through direct observation that no one occupied that space, that I was reacting to stimulus that didn't exist except as electrochemical activity in my brain that nonetheless felt more real than the tangible objects I could touch and measure. The voice in the transmission became progressively clearer as the hours accumulated, as though we were traveling deeper into whatever region of space-time was generating it, approaching some source that existed outside the normal dimensional frameworks that defined where things could be. It spoke of convergence points and temporal recursion, of events that had already occurred but hadn't yet been decided, of certainties that were simultaneously inevitable and contingent, philosophical paradoxes that suggested whoever was speaking had either achieved profound understanding of reality's fundamental nature or had descended so completely into madness that their delusions had achieved a kind of internal coherence that mimicked wisdom. Captain Val convened the senior staff in the strategy room, the circular chamber where tactical decisions were normally made through careful analysis of holographic projections showing enemy positions and fleet movements. But the holoprojectors were malfunctioning, displaying geometries that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, by impossible structures that hurt to observe because they violated every intuitive understanding of how shapes could fit together. She announced that we would maintain course, continue monitoring our situation, trust that the anomaly would eventually release us, or that engineering would identify the system failure, allowing us to regain control and revert to real space. Her confidence seemed forced. The kind of leadership performance that recognized morale required projection of certainty, even when circumstances made certainty impossible. When honest assessment would require acknowledging that we were experiencing something unprecedented, something that our training and protocols and institutional knowledge provided no framework for addressing. The deaths began on the second day, though calling them deaths might be imprecise, because the bodies we found didn't exhibit any conventional cause of mortality, didn't show signs of violence or system failure or anything that medical analysis could identify as the mechanism that had transitioned them from living to deceased. They simply stopped, biological processes ceasing simultaneously, as though something had flipped a switch that shut down all the electrochemical reactions that constituted consciousness and organic function, leaving corpses that were physically intact but entirely absent of whatever animating principle distinguished persons from meat. The first victim was a junior technician named Palm, who'd been working in one of the auxiliary power distribution nodes, found slumped over his console with an expression that suggested he'd been in the middle of ordinary thought when existence had simply ended without warning or pain or even sufficient time to register surprise. The bodies accumulated over the following hours, personnel discovered in various locations throughout the ship, always alone despite the Ravager carrying a crew of over 37,000, always positioned in ways that suggested they'd been engaged in routine activities when whatever claimed them had manifested, their deaths contributing nothing to understanding their cause except the growing statistical certainty that we were being systematically reduced according to some pattern that remained opaque to our desperate analysis. Medical teams examined the deceased with increasing desperation, ran every diagnostic protocol available, consulted databases that contained information about exotic toxins and neurological agents, and all the creative ways that Imperial science had discovered to terminate biological function, but nothing matched the presentation. Nothing explained why healthy individuals were simply ceasing to exist in ways that left their bodies behind but removed everything that had made those bodies meaningful. The voice in the transmission started addressing me directly sometime during the second day, using my name and rank, speaking about things it shouldn't have known, personal details that existed only in classified personnel files or in my own memory, childhood incidents and private thoughts and the specific texture of guilt I'd carried since participating in a pacification operation on Geonosis, where we'd been ordered to neutralize a village suspected of harboring rebel sympathizers and had discovered too late that the intelligence had been fabricated or misattributed, that we'd killed civilians who'd never posed any threat to Imperial authority, whose only crime had been existing in proximity to someone else's rebellion. The voice spoke about these things with a kind of clinical detachment, describing my actions and their consequences without judgment or emotion, simply cataloging the facts of what I'd done and what those actions had cost in lives and suffering, forcing me to acknowledge details I'd successfully avoided examining too carefully through the combination of duty and willful ignorance that allowed Imperial personnel to function without being paralyzed by moral consideration of what we were actually implementing. Captain Val ordered me to discontinue monitoring the transmission, to shut down the communications systems entirely if necessary, to eliminate whatever conduit was allowing this intrusion into our operations, but I couldn't comply because the voice wasn't coming through the communications equipment anymore, wasn't an external signal that could be blocked or filtered or terminated through technical intervention. It was inside my head now, speaking directly into my consciousness, through means I couldn't identify or resist, bypassing all the normal sensory channels and imprinting itself directly onto my neural patterns in ways that made the distinction between external stimulus and internal thought progressively difficult to maintain. I tried explaining this to Val, but the words came out wrong, fragmented and confused, my linguistic processing apparently degraded by whatever was happening to me, and I watched her expression shift from anger to something else. Recognition, maybe, the dawning understanding that I was experiencing the same deterioration that had preceded the deaths, that I was becoming another casualty of whatever force was harvesting our crew, one person at a time. The hyperspace tunnel started changing, the familiar blue-white light streaks that represented compressed space-time developing irregularities, dark spots that expanded and contracted like breathing, geometric patterns that resolved into shapes that almost resembled writing if you could tolerate looking at them long enough, symbols that seemed to carry meaning even though I'd never studied any language that used those particular forms. Other crew members reported similar observations, described seeing faces in the distortions or hearing music that originated from no discernible source or smelling atmospheric compositions that shouldn't have been possible in our hermetically sealed environment. Individual hallucinations that nonetheless shared enough common features to suggest we were all perceiving different aspects of the same underlying phenomenon. Different sensory modalities translating the same impossible stimulus into whatever forms our respective neurology could process without complete collapse. Engineering finally identified what they claimed was the problem, explaining that our hyperdrive had somehow become entangled with a spatial anomaly that existed at the intersection of multiple dimensional frameworks, that we were no longer traveling through normal hyperspace, but had somehow been diverted into a region where the usual laws governing mass and energy and causation operated according to different parameters, or possibly didn't operate at all, where the distinction between potential and actual had collapsed, and we were experiencing something like a probability field where multiple incompatible realities were attempting to exist simultaneously. The explanation made no sense according to any physics I'd been taught at the academy, contradicted fundamental principles about how hyperspace functioned and what kinds of phenomena could exist within it. But the engineering team delivered their assessment with such desperate conviction that I understood. They needed to believe they'd identified the problem even if their analysis was actually just elaborate rationalization that provided comforting structure to experiences that were fundamentally inexplicable. The Emperor's voice joined the transmission sometime during the third day. That distinctive raspy whisper that every Imperial officer had learned to recognize from the propaganda broadcasts and recorded speeches that played constantly throughout the fleet. That particular quality of controlled malevolence that made even innocuous statements sound like threats delivered by someone who'd personally witnessed your every failure and was simply waiting for the opportune moment to punish them. He spoke about destiny and order and the necessary architecture of suffering that maintained civilization against the chaos that lurked at reality's edges. Philosophical abstractions that I'd heard variations of throughout my service, but that carried new weight now, suggested meanings that the official interpretations had deliberately obscured or that I'd been too indoctrinated to recognize. He described the unknown regions as a kind of wound in space-time, a place where the Emperor's vision couldn't fully penetrate, where forces older than the Republic or the Empire persisted in forms that resisted the ordering principles he'd been systematically imposing on the galaxy through decades of careful manipulation and calculated violence. The dead started appearing in impossible locations. Personnel who'd been logged as deceased during the previous days now visible in corridors or compartments where their bodies hadn't been found, moving with normal purposefulness as though unaware of their terminated status, performing duties according to their assigned rotations, responding to questions with appropriate technical language, but something wrong in their eyes, something absent or perhaps something extra, a quality of attention that suggested consciousness, but not the specific consciousness that had previously animated those particular bodies. I watched Palm, the first casualty, working at a console in the main communications hub, his hands moving across the controls with practiced efficiency, and when I asked him direct questions about what had happened, how he'd died, or where he'd been during the intervening time, he simply looked at me with those wrong eyes and said that nothing had happened, that he'd been here all along performing his assigned functions, that my memory of his death was probably false recollection induced by the stress of our anomalous situation. Captain Val issued orders with increasing desperation, commands that made progressively less sense as coherent strategy, instructing personnel to secure locations against threats she couldn't specify, to implement defensive procedures for scenarios she couldn't articulate, her tactical discipline fragmenting under the accumulated weight of circumstances that violated every framework she'd developed for understanding how reality operated and how authority could impose order on chaos through proper application of force and protocol. I watched her on the command deck, observed the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching, noticed how her eyes tracked movements that no one else could see, how she flinched at sounds that didn't register on our audio monitoring equipment, her competent facade maintained through sheer discipline, even as whatever was happening to the rest of us was happening to her as well, eroding the boundaries between perception and hallucination until every experience became equally unreliable and equally true. The ship itself started behaving strangely, exhibiting properties that violated its documented specifications and design parameters, corridors that seemed to extend beyond their blueprinted dimensions, compartments that couldn't be reached despite clear routes marked on the deck plans, turbolifts that deposited personnel on levels that didn't officially exist where they encountered versions of the crew who claimed to have been stationed there for weeks, despite having no corresponding entries in the assignment logs. The internal monitoring network became increasingly unreliable, cameras showing empty spaces where personnel reported dense crowds, recording conversations in chambers that other sensors indicated were depressurized, capturing images of equipment and architecture that didn't match any configurations in the Ravager's construction documentation. The reactor output fluctuated in patterns that should have caused catastrophic failure, but somehow maintained stable power distribution, the engineering teams unable to explain how systems that were demonstrably malfunctioning continued to function adequately enough to sustain basic operations. I found myself in sections of the ship I didn't remember accessing, discovered I'd lost hours to periods I couldn't account for, would suddenly become aware that I was performing tasks I hadn't consciously decided to initiate, my body apparently operating on autopilot, while my attention had been elsewhere, or perhaps my consciousness had simply been absent for those intervals, evacuated from my neural substrate while something else used my physical form for purposes it didn't bother explaining to the intelligence that normally inhabited this body. Other crew members reported similar experiences, described finding themselves in the middle of conversations they didn't remember starting or completing work. They had no recollection of beginning, the continuity of identity becoming intermittent, consciousness flickering like malfunctioning illumination that couldn't maintain consistent power levels. The voice that had been speaking through the transmission revealed itself finally, identified itself as something that had been waiting in this corrupted region of space-time, something that had existed before the Republic and would persist after the Empire's inevitable collapse, something that fed on the specific kind of suffering that emerged when conscious beings recognized the fundamental meaninglessness of the structures they'd devoted their existence to maintaining, when they understood that order was simply slower chaos and that authority was force dressed in ceremony, and that every hierarchy ultimately rested on the willingness to inflict violence on those who refused to pretend that power constituted legitimacy. It spoke about the Emperor with intimate familiarity, suggested they'd made some kind of arrangement, that the Empire's expansion into these regions was intentional rather than exploratory, that we'd been sent here deliberately to feed whatever resided in this dimensional wound, that our suffering and gradual dissolution served purposes that transcended our individual existence or the strategic objectives we'd imagined we were pursuing. The revelation should have provoked outrage or disbelief, should have triggered defensive psychological reactions that protected our sense of meaning and purpose against information that threatened to undermine the narratives we'd constructed about our service and its significance. But I felt only a kind of tired recognition, acknowledgement that I'd always suspected something like this underneath the official explanations and patriotic rhetoric, that the Empire's brutality had always seemed excessive if its goals were merely political control, that the systematic cruelty suggested it was producing something beyond security or governance, harvesting some resource that required suffering to generate and that flowed toward destinations we weren't cleared to understand. The Emperor's interest in the unknown regions, his deployment of significant resources to map and penetrate territories that offered minimal strategic value, his personal involvement in expeditions that seemed to accomplish nothing except exposing personnel to conditions that destroyed them in ways that served no obvious tactical purpose. All of it suddenly made terrible sense if the actual objective was feeding whatever existed in these corrupted spaces, maintaining some bargain with forces that predated human civilization and that would presumably persist long after we'd exhausted our usefulness. The crew started disappearing rather than dying, personnel simply absent from spaces they'd occupied moments before, their physical forms ceasing to exist in ways that left no bodies and no forensic evidence except the records indicating they'd been present and then suddenly weren't. Erased from reality as thoroughly as if they'd never existed, though their names remained on the rosters and in the logs and in the memories of those who'd known them, even if those memories felt progressively less certain, as though the disappeared personnel were being retroactively edited from history and our recollections were slowly catching up to the revised timeline. I watched this happen to Coral, the Bith navigator, observed him working at his station one moment, and then the next moment, there was just empty space where he'd been, the console continuing to operate as though someone was still interfacing with it, but no physical presence detectable through any means of observation, his existence continuing in some sense, but no longer manifest in the dimension where the rest of us were experiencing reality. Captain Val finally broke the psychological armor she'd maintained through decades of military service, cracking under accumulated stresses that exceeded any conceivable training or preparation. her command presence dissolving into something naked and terrified as she stood on the bridge announcing that we were being judged, that our deaths and disappearances were punishment for crimes we'd committed in service of an empire that itself served something darker than mere political ambition, that we were being consumed by the same forces we'd been feeding through our operations across the galaxy every time we'd followed orders that required us to inflict suffering on populations that posed no actual threat except their refusal to submit to authority they hadn't chosen and didn't benefit from. She spoke about villages burned and prisoners tortured and the endless casualties of maintaining order through systematic violence, spoke about it with the kind of clinical detail that suggested she'd been maintaining meticulous internal records of every atrocity she'd participated in or commanded, had been carrying the full weight of those actions without allowing herself to consciously acknowledge what that weight actually represented. The remaining crew, perhaps a few thousand out of the 37,000 who'd started this journey, gathered in whatever locations they could reach, formed small groups that provided the illusion of safety through proximity, though we all understood by then that safety was impossible, that we were trapped in something we couldn't escape, and that our gradual consumption was inevitable, regardless of what defensive measures we attempted. Some personnel attempted mutiny, tried to seize control from Val, and force the ship to revert to real space, through the sheer insistence of their will if technological means wouldn't cooperate. But the mutineers disappeared mid-action, simply ceased to exist in the middle of their attempted coup, reality editing them out like grammatical errors being corrected by some vast inhuman editor who was revising our existence toward whatever conclusion it preferred. Others retreated into religious or philosophical frameworks, attempted to interpret our situation through existing belief systems that provided explanatory narratives about suffering and transcendence and purposes that exceeded mortal comprehension, but those frameworks felt inadequate to the specifics of what we were experiencing, like using ancient maps to navigate territories that hadn't existed when the charts were drawn. I spent my final hours, I assume they're final, though I suppose it's possible I'm already dead or disappeared, and this writing is occurring in some post-existent state that retains the capacity for documentation without actually inhabiting dimensional space in any conventional sense. Attempting to compile this account, trying to preserve some record of what happened, even though I have no way to transmit it beyond this cursed hyperspace corridor, and no reason to believe anyone will ever discover it if the Ravager doesn't eventually return to real space. The voice continues speaking, now addressing all of us collectively, explaining that we're being transformed rather than destroyed, that our consciousness is being extracted and reconfigured and incorporated into something larger, that will persist but not as individuals, not as distinct personalities with continuous identity, but rather as components in whatever vast intelligence uses these dimensional wounds as sensory organs or feeding mechanisms, or perhaps both simultaneously. The process is described as neither punishment nor reward, but simply function, the way a stomach processes nutrients, converting complex organization into simpler forms that can be absorbed and utilized for purposes that the food itself doesn't need to understand. The Emperor's voice speaks over the other one, contradicts it, or perhaps complements it, suggests that this was always the plan, that the Empire exists to organize suffering at sufficient scale, that it can be harvested efficiently, that individual human rights and dignity and autonomy are obstacles to this harvest and must be systematically eliminated through the kind of totalitarian structure that reduces persons to functions and makes their consumption feel like duty or destiny rather than violation. He describes it as necessary, claims that feeding whatever exists in these regions prevents something worse, that the bargain he's maintaining requires constant payment in consciousness and suffering, and that refusing to pay would result in the entity simply taking what it wants, without negotiation or limitation, consuming entire worlds rather than selected crews, ending civilization rather than merely corroding it from within. The justification sounds like the same logic that's always characterized imperial policy, the same explanations for why cruelty serves order, and why violence maintains peace, and why our suffering purchases security for populations who will never know what we've sacrificed or been sacrificed to protect them from. I don't know if I believe it. Don't know if the Emperor's explanation is truth or sophisticated lie or both simultaneously. One of those statements that's accurate about mechanisms, while fundamentally misleading about purposes, describing what happens without honestly addressing why it happens or who benefits from its continuation. What I do know is that I'm dissolving, can feel my thoughts becoming progressively less coherent, boundaries between myself and the environment growing permeable, my consciousness leaking out into the corrupted space-time that surrounds us, or perhaps being drawn out deliberately by the intelligence that's been consuming our crew member by member, death by death, disappearance by disappearance. The experience isn't painful exactly, more like relaxing a tension I didn't realize I'd been maintaining, releasing the effort required to remain a distinct self rather than simply dissolving into the larger patterns of energy and information that constitute reality at levels where individual identity becomes meaningless category. The last thing I'm aware of before something essential, fragments beyond recovery, is the knowledge that we never left hyperspace, that the Ravager remains in this dimensional wound, that anyone attempting to investigate what happened will find no debris field or distress beacon or any conventional evidence of disaster, just an absence where a Star Destroyer should be but isn't, a gap in the patrol schedules and communication logs that will be classified and buried and eventually forgotten as the Empire moves on to consuming the next crew in the next operation that serves purposes that remain classified at levels where even asking questions constitutes treason worth punishing through the same process that claimed us, feeding the same entities that exist in regions where the Emperor's vision penetrates more completely than anywhere else, because those regions are somehow his, bought through bargains that predate the Empire's official formation and that will presumably persist after its eventual fragmentation into whatever warlord territories and successor states emerge from the ruins of an institution that was never actually about governance or security, or any of the purposes it claimed, but was rather about organizing consciousness at scale, sufficient to harvest it for beings that exist in spaces, between spaces where time operates according to principles that make past and future lose meaning, and everything becomes an eternal present of consumption and dissolution and transformation into something that isn't quite death and isn't quite life, but rather the state that exists between those categories where the distinction stops mattering because the observer who would make the distinction has been incorporated into the system being observed and can no longer maintain sufficient separation to generate meaningful judgment about what's happening or what it means or whether meaning itself is just another artifact of consciousness that dissolves when consciousness dissolves, leaving only raw process stripped of any interpretive framework that would make it comprehensible to beings who persist as individuals rather than allowing themselves to be absorbed into the vast impersonal machinery that grinds everything eventually into the same undifferentiated substrate from which new forms might emerge, though whether those forms will retain any continuity with what dissolved to produce them remains uncertain in ways that uncertainty itself becomes meaningless when the consciousness that experiences uncertainty has been distributed across dimensional frameworks that can't sustain the kind of unified perspective required for experiencing anything as uncertain, rather than simply experiencing all possibilities simultaneously, without privileging any particular outcome over alternatives that are equally actual in whatever strange geometry governs existence in regions where the Empire sent us, knowing we wouldn't return but recording our dissolution anyway, for purposes that remain obscure even now as I fragment into components that will presumably serve functions I'll never understand, because understanding requires the kind of integrated consciousness I'm losing even as I write these final words that may or may not ever be read by anyone capable of reading them in the conventional sense, assuming anyone ever reaches this location, and assuming the record persists in forms that remain accessible to beings who experience reality sequentially rather than all at once.